He was a great pioneer. We don't always think of him as that, but he was a true prophet. And the Book of Mormon's true, and we should all read it more than we do. But I have a story here, since this is Pioneer Day, that I'd like to share with you, all of you. Some of you may have heard it, but maybe some haven't. And this is entitled Pioneers and Grasshoppers. This is the season when our minds go back 100 years to that historic period when our pioneer forefathers were establishing themselves in these mountain communities. On each 24th of July, we recount their deeds, relive their faith, and hold up their virtues before our minds that we may draw from their strength. The 24th of July gains additional significance as we go back 2,500 years beyond the pioneers to the time when the prophet Isaiah also centered his attention upon our time and upon this place, as he prophesied, "And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Each year we might well check up individually to see how well we are carrying out the purpose for which we were established here, and what we can do to improve our effectiveness. Certainly one of the most inspirational events of our modern world, and one that we might profitably try to equal, was the courage and faith that brought this little band of persecuted men and women to these valleys. They were driven from their homes in the dead of winter. But in spite of sickness, suffering, and death, they made their way across an almost trackless waste to build their homes in what was then a most forbidding part of the American desert. They were willing to give everything, including their lives, for the word of the Lord and the chance to share their newfound knowledge with others. The testing and hardship of the journey itself helped to make the pioneers greater and stronger than they were. But the most important part of the accomplishment projected by Isaiah was still ahead. Many times comparisons have been made of the experiences of those who came to these valleys with another group of pioneers who some 3,300 years earlier had made their difficult way across the Arabian desert with the hope of establishing themselves in the promised land of Canaan. They had just been liberated from Egyptian bondage, and then, as now, God was trying to develop a righteous people to do his will. The most earnest desire and greatest delight of the Lord has always been in a righteous people, those who would believe his word and work in his program of human betterment leading to eternal exaltation. It is interesting to recount the experiences and think about the successes and failures of each of these groups in the light of causes and consequences. The Utah pioneers were hardly beyond the reach of religious persecution when a scourge of crickets descended upon them and threatened to wipe out the entire settlement. But the Old Testament tells of a far more serious experience where several 100,000 Hebrews were wiped out by some grasshoppers. These two situations were quite different in one way, however, inasmuch as the grasshoppers of the Hebrews were imaginary and did their destructive work not in the grain fields, but in the minds of the people themselves. Soon after the Hebrews were beyond the reach of their Egyptian taskmasters, they were ready to take possession of the choice land of their fathers. This was a very fertile region, described as a land flowing with milk and honey. It was contemplated that here this chosen people would build up their homeland, have their own government, and become a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a successful and happy people. But all blessings are given according to law, and the Hebrews themselves stood in their own way and prevented their own accomplishment. The Lord had instructed Moses to send scouts ahead to make themselves familiar with the conditions to be met in the land that they hoped to possess. Accordingly, Moses chose 12 men, one from each tribe, to serve as spies and to learn how numerous the people were and the extent of their strength. These 12 men spent 40 days exploring this ancient land of their fathers, and then they returned and made their report to the people. All 12 men gave a most glowing account of the fertility of the soil. They said it was indeed a rich land, flowing with milk and honey. Joshua and Caleb, 2 of the 12 scouts, recommended that they go forward immediately and possess the land as the Lord had directed them. But the majority report made by the other 10 was negative. They reported that some of the land was occupied by giant warriors, and in their opinion, the Israelites could not successfully proceed against them. If they should try, they felt that they would be overcome, and their wives and children would become the prey of the enemy. Then the 10 compared the land's occupants with themselves by saying, "We were in our own sight as grasshoppers." Mm-hmm. By this appraisal of themselves, they sealed their own fate. As a great American president once said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Certainly one of the greatest hazards in any undertaking, ancient or modern, comes when we allow ourselves to become afraid. It is so easy to think negatively and fail before we start. A little fear or a little discouragement will often completely close the mind to even an ordinary accomplishment. It has always been true, and probably always will be true, that the most common reason for failure is the tendency in some of us to belittle our possibilities and think of ourselves as did the Israelites, as grasshoppers. A discouraged man is always a weak man. It is impossible to go forward while we are trembling with fear, just as it is impossible to think little and be big at the same time. And yet, the most widespread disease in the world is the inferiority complex. Most people suffer from too mean an appraisal of themselves. We are still too much tainted with the old sectarian doctrine of man's natural depravity and weakness. This is a doctrine of evil which destroys our strength. For as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. The facts are that man was created for strength, not for weakness. He was created in God's image and was endowed with God's attributes. The children of God were designed to succeed, not to fail. There is nothing depraved about the man God has made except that which man brings upon himself. And when the negative report of the scouting committee got the Israelites to thinking like grasshoppers, it immediately wiped out all of their chances for success. The record says that they lifted up their voices and cried all night. Then they began murmuring not only against Moses and Aaron, but also against God. The whole congregation was saying, "Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt." They said, Why hath the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return to Egypt? They increased their fears as they passed them around among themselves until finally they decided that they would replace Moses and Aaron with their own leaders, and then under their own power return to Egypt and get their old jobs back as Egyptian slaves. Joshua and Caleb tried to dissuade them from this rash course. They reminded them of their goals. They pointed out that the Lord had already promised them the land, and if they did their part, certainly the Lord would do his. They pled with the people, saying, "Rebel not against the Lord, for the Lord is with us." But the people would not be dissuaded from the idea of their own weakness. Their own fears and feelings of inferiority had made them rebel against God and had completely destroyed their interest in their promised land, when on the very threshold of its possession. The Lord seemed very disappointed in his people. He reminded them of the recent miracles in Egypt, but even he seemed unable to break up their rebellion, and finally he gave up and allowed them to turn back. But evil must always bear its own share of punishment, and God decreed that because of their disobedience and lack of faith, they should wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1 year of penalty was imposed for each day that their scouts had been in the promised land. The 10 men who brought back the grasshopper report and incited rebellion died in a plague. And the Lord decreed that because the Israelites disobeyed his counsel, that none of their adults, then over 20 years of age, except Joshua and Caleb, should ever enter this wonderful land that they had brought, or that they had thought about for so long. The Lord said to them, "Your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness." And all adult Hebrews lost their promised blessings because they chose to discount their own abilities as well as the powers of the Lord. Their fears had made them guilty of 2 capital sins. First, disbelief in God, and second, disbelief in themselves. Their punishment was to spend 40 long, weary years of useless wandering in a barren desert. They lived without homes, without adequate food or clothing, while their carcasses fell in the wilderness, until none were left to enter the promised land on which they themselves had turned their backs in fear. Imaginary grasshoppers in the mind can do anyone great damage. The mind is the place where grasshoppers have been hardest to handle, whether in ancient or modern times. In Arabia or in America, it is pretty important that we get control of our grasshoppers. We have had no serious recurrence of the crickets to destroy our grain fields, but we are still bothered by grasshoppers. When our national scouts give their reports on Cuba or Russia, we sometimes have the feeling that they have some grasshoppers in their minds. We sometimes have the same kind of feeling when we think of what the Lord has commanded us to do. Then, like the Israelites, we sometimes allow ourselves to think wrong, and once these grasshoppers get into our imaginations, they are pretty difficult to get out. It was, of course, perfectly natural that the Israelites, who had been living like slaves, should also think like slaves. But how could they hope to succeed when they appeared to themselves incapable of accomplishing their objectives and lacking in the courage and faith necessary to fulfill their divine destiny? This deficiency in the thinking of the Hebrews caused them to spend 40 years in wandering while God was trying to change their attitudes. But we have some of the same problems. Our grasshopper inclinations are still robbing us of our blessings, and we are being held back by our own imaginary weaknesses. The Lord intends us to be strong. He wants us to take possession of our promised lands. But so frequently we make up our own grasshopper reports, listing all the reasons why the assignment can't be filled. When we see ourselves as grasshoppers, that is the level on which we may expect our effort and accomplishment to take place. Before we may realize our promised land, we must get rid of our grasshopper vision, do away with our rebellions, and just do the things that the Lord wants us to do. Then, what a great people we could become. Imagine